Please pray with me. God of grace, God of hope, God of beauty, God of new beginnings, God of challenge and change, stir new possibilities in us this day as we come together as your people on this Easter Sunday. Amen. You ever think to yourself, this is as good as life is going to get? Do you ever think that tomorrow isn't going to be any better than today? Ever put limitations on your imagination or upon your heart? Do you ever think to yourself that God is this big, where you put God in a box, and you say, God is like this, nothing less and nothing more? Perhaps for some of us, God is the big clock maker in the sky who winds up the clock and then steps back until the clock winds down. Or maybe God is that big finger shaker in the sky who sends the lightning bolts down when we mess up. What is your concept of God? Some of us may think of God like a lucky charm. Or when I was a kid, it was kind of a weird thing to say, but we had rabbit's feet. And you tie them to your handlebars of your bicycle. Does anybody remember that? And they would be like bright orange and lime green, kind of a weird tradition. But if you had your lucky rabbit's foot, then everything would be okay. Some of us think of Jesus and God in that way as our lucky charm, like a lucky rabbit's foot. But sometimes we place parameters on God. We place parameters on ourselves. And we think this is as good as it gets. The theologian Richard Bach says, argue for your limitations long enough, and sure enough, they're yours. And that's what's going on for the disciples on that first Easter. They are arguing for their limitations. They have seen Jesus crucified with their own eyes. They have seen Caiaphas, the temple priest, in collusion with the Roman Empire, turn their back upon Jesus. They saw him die upon the cross. They saw him laid in the tomb, and they thought it was over. The Roman Empire had won yet again. What do we expect of God this Easter? What do we think of the movement of the Spirit in our life? Are we open to being surprised? Are we open to being blessed? Because when Peter and John got to the tomb for the first time, they looked in and they saw it was empty. They thought it was game over. And then we pick up the story of Mary Magdalene. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, and one at the head and the other at the feet. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Another insult. Jesus' body being stolen. Mary Magdalene, like Peter and like John on that first Easter, were arguing for their limitations. And we do that too. Sometimes circumstances are so difficult or challenging in our life that we say it's game over. In 1984, in the beautiful city of Sarajevo, in what was then Yugoslavia, surrounded what has now become Serbia and Slovenia and Croatia, and Bosnia. Sarajevo was considered to be a multicultural city, and in 1984, the Winter Olympics were held there. For those who have some miles on your odometer, do you remember that? 1984, the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, this beautiful multicultural city where Muslims and Christians for centuries had lived together in harmony. But slowly, people who were nationalists and were racist and were looking down on one another's religion, some of the leaders began to plant seeds of hatred and intolerance. And over time, those seeds began to flourish, and a civil war came upon the people of Sarajevo. One of the groups that were planting the seeds formed a militia, and they put artillery and snipers all above the mountains looking down into Sarajevo. And many were wounded, and many lost their lives. No food could go in, and so people began to be hungry, and some began to starve. It was a time when the people lost their sense of hope. They felt that hope had died. That's what it's like for Mary and for Peter and for John that first Easter. They thought all hope was lost. And so Mary said those words to the people in the tomb, and she didn't know that they were angels. They were messengers from God. In verse 14, when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. She had parameters on her eyes, and she couldn't even recognize the risen Christ right in front of her. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" And supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Again, her parameters, her limits, her lenses are clouded. And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And her eyes were opened, and she recognized that the risen Christ was right in her very midst. She heard her name, this concept that God is intimately involved in your life and in my life, stirring new possibilities within us. And 2,000 years later, do we believe that to be true? Are we willing to set aside our limitations and our parameters as to what is real and what is true, and open to the ways in which the risen Christ is breathing new life into you and into me and into this congregation collectively? Are we open to having the boundaries of our imagination and hearts opened wide? Back to Sarajevo. There was a man in that city, now a year into the Civil War, and it was the winter and the people were cold. And Vladimir Smirnov was a cellist in the Sarajevo Symphony. And he said, "One day I just awakened, and I was tired of being afraid. I was tired of hating my enemy. I was tired of living in despair." And so Vladimir, one day, he said, "I awakened." And what he did was he put on his tuxedo that he wore when he played for the Sarajevo Symphony. And he put his cello in the case. And in his tuxedo, he walked through the empty streets of Sarajevo. And he came to the public square, which was considered a killing field, where no one in their right mind would enter. And he sat upon the rubble as the snipers watched him. And he took out his cello, and he began to play folk songs of his boyhood. And he began to play these beautiful, beautiful classical pieces of the masters. And the people who were hiding behind their smashed out windows and their broken down homes from the artillery, they held their breath because they thought the next bullet would be for him. And he played for over an hour while the snipers watched. And then he stood up, he bowed, he put his cello in the case, and he walked back to his home through the empty streets. Every day for approximately 6 months at approximately the same time, Vladimir would enter into that place and he would play. And he was never harmed. After the Civil War was over, the snipers were interviewed and they said, "Why didn't you stop him?" And what they said was, he was our hope. He was playing for himself. He was playing for our enemies. He was playing for this embattled city. But he was also playing for our own humanity. And we knew to take his life was to rob ourselves of our humanity as well. Vladimir gave his neighbors hope. And he offered his enemies a new way of being. That's what Jesus represents on Easter Sunday. He overcame the despair of the time. He overcame the violence and the force of the Roman Empire. He came to offer the path of love, to say that hope always has the final word, that love ultimately always wins. And do we believe that to be true? Are we like Vladimir Smirnov in that city of Sarajevo? Are we open to being awakened to new possibilities in us? What are your longings? What are your needs? What are your hopes? What are your struggles? What are your dreams? The Jesus who overcame the tomb desires to enter into our lives, to bless us, and to make us whole. This is the good news. Thanks be to God. And may God's people say, amen.